Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar hosted by us at Swedish Exergy. Today we're going to talk about high value animal feed and DDGS with our Exergy PSSD dryer. With us today is Manish Verma, our Business Development Manager. He will be answering any questions you might have during the webinar. Presenting today will be me, Christopher Glavender. I'm the Sales and Marketing Coordinator here at Swedish Exergy. First, before we begin, there's some good things to know. Like you might have noticed, we're using the YouTube platform to perform and host this webinar. And in order to ask any questions through the chat functionality on the right-hand side, you need to sign into a Google account. However, if you do not have a Google account available, you can always send questions either during or after the webinar to mv@swedishexergy.com. I'd also like to mention that we have another webinar upcoming in the beginning of June on the topic of biomass. The registration for this webinar will open next week. A lot of time for this webinar is around 30 minutes, with some time at the end for questions. If you would like to know more about us, our products, you can always visit swedishexergy.com, or you can just contact us directly. So, just want to quickly go through the agenda today. First, want to touch base a little bit about who we are and our experience and know-how. The benefits you will receive by drying animal feed with superheated steam, and the salient features that you receive by using our Exergy PSSD dryer. Also how our Exergy PSSD dryer works. And at the end, a conclusion to conclude the whole webinar before we go to some questions. Well, let's begin. So who are we and what do we do? Well, Swedish Exergy are the inventors of the superheated steam dryer. We are an engineering company based in Gothenburg, Sweden. And like I said, we invented the superheated steam dryer in the beginning of the 1970s. In 1979, we delivered our first dryer, which is still today, over 40 years later, operable. We did, however, replace this dryer with a new dryer to larger, double the capacity of the dryer. But the old one still remains and act as a backup dryer. We are a global company with subsidiaries and sales reps worldwide. We have also executed projects globally. Our core business is dryers, but we also supply evaporators and rotary valves. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of drying with superheated steam and the benefits that the animal feed will receive when being dried with superheated steam. First, some of the products that we have experience in, that we have either conducted tests on in our pilot test or we have commercial plants on. And it is wet distillers grains with solubles from wheat, barley, and corn. We have an ongoing project for citrus peel, sugar beet pulp, olive pomace, grains, cotton seeds, oil cakes, but also others. We welcome all companies to send us samples that we can perform a mutual pilot test on in our pilot test to see what benefits you will receive. So what are some of the advantages with drying animal feed with superheated steam? Well, the main advantage is that you're able to achieve bypass protein without any chemicals at all. And this is because when the protein gets exposed to the superheated steam and dried in the superheated steam, we change the molecule structure to a less water-soluble one, which means that it can bypass the rumen of the cattle. And in fact, more than 50% of this protein is bypassed or is bypassing the rumen to be taken up in the intestine instead, hence the word bypass protein. But we still maintain the intestine digestibility. With this, we get an increased milk and meat production because the animal gets a lot healthier and gets a lot more protein. We also get very high levels of AATs and amino acids, removal of anti-nutritional factors, improved palatability, and also some animals have a hard time digesting very starchy feed. By drying the feed in our dryer, we get a very high levels of gelatinization of the feed, which helps the animal digest the starch and the feed better. And then one main thing is also that all feed that gets dried in our superheated steam dryer gets 100% sterile. There's no traces, nothing of any bacteria, salmonella or anything. It's 100% sterilized, and we have done independent testing on this to verify that this claim is actually true. All in all of this leads to an increased market value of the feed itself. Same goes for DDGS. The same benefits apply for the DDGS part. You get bypass protein, sterilization, and all of that. Then as a side note, I would also like to talk a little bit about processing or conditioning of oil seeds. We don't necessarily dry the oil seeds, but we condition them in superheated steam. You still get the benefits like we talked about with the increase in bypass protein and no bacteria growth because it's sterile. But what you also get is an improved oil yield and quality of the oil. You get a great oil quality after water degumming, and there's no need for any chemical refining, so this makes the whole process a lot simpler and cost effective. Here's an independent study done by the Swedish Agricultural University on the differences with feed dried in our dryer compared to conventional dryers. And I'm not going to go through the whole study, but it is available, and you can contact us if you would like to know more. What I would like to highlight is that the increase of AATs and amino acids. In this case, you can see the high increase of AATs, which is amino acids available to small intestine. But at the same time, we also get very low PBVs, which is rumen protein balance. You can also see in the lower part that we don't really change the characteristics of the feed itself. We actually are able to increase the intestine digestibility by a small margin as well. So now that we talked a little bit about the benefits received when you dry animal feed with superheated steam drying, we would like to talk a little bit about the other features that you will receive by using a superheated steam dryer compared to a conventional dryer. And we will talk about our Exergy PSSD, the Exergy pressurized superheated steam dryers. One of the main things that worries factories and feed producers today are fires and explosions. If we look at this bar chart created by ERI Solutions, I mean, we can believe them. If you look at the top 3 things that leads to combustion-related losses and monetary losses, it is dryers, vessels, tanks and vessels, and RTOs that are causing these monetary losses. And it's started to be kind of a standard within this industry that if you have a dryer, well, you kind of have to expect that you might have a fire at some time. Even goes so far that some of the dryer manufacturers actually says, and I quote, "All dryers are going to have a fire, and anyone saying anything different is a little bit too optimistic," end quote. Well, I guess we are a little bit too optimistic then, because we don't have any fires, we don't have any explosion. They can't happen within our dryers. And you're probably wondering, well, how are you able to achieve that? And it's actually quite simple. I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with the fire triangule. It describes the 3 things that fire needs to survive. It needs oxygen, it needs heat, it needs fuel. Well, within our superheated steam dryer, we don't have any oxygen. We displace all of the oxygen within the dryer with superheated steam to get a complete inert atmosphere, which in turn leads that we don't have any risk for fires or explosions. This, of course, leads to a lot of benefits. One of the main things is, of course, the safety aspect, both for the workers and for the plant itself, that you don't have to worry about any fires or explosions, but also a lot of monetary benefits. You don't need any spark detection system or fire prevention systems. It's also a lot lower insurance cost. We actually heard from some feed producers that it's actually hard for them to get the insurance on their dryers because it's so often, or the chances of fires are so great. But with our dryers, it's fairly easy and the insurance is very low. Also, since there's no fire explosion risk, there's no need for any ATEX classification of our dryers, which makes approval process and permitting a whole lot easier. And talking about permitting, since we are using a closed loop design of our superheated steam dryer, we don't have any air emissions, VOCs, or odors released to the atmosphere. And this is also a major thing that it makes it a lot easier to get all these permits, to follow all the regulations. And in fact, we actually have a dryer that's placed right in the middle of the city, and there has not been any complaints or any problems whatsoever. If you think back a little bit to the bar chart of the causes to monetary loss for feed producers, RTO was on the number 3 spot. And since we're using a closed loop design, there's actually no need for an RTO or any other type of off-gas treatment. We're also extremely energy efficient. We can recover upwards to 95% of the energy that's put into the dryer. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I also get a very uniform drying, since all of the wet particles are suspended within the drying media, which is superheated steam. And the whole drying process from feed to discharge takes only about 10 to 20 seconds. We also know that land is expensive and scarce, so that's why we're building on height rather than width. Another main benefit is that we're using indirect heating, which opens up a whole lot of various and heat sources that's available to power the dryer. For example, you can use natural gas, you can use hot gas, we can use electricity with an MBR, of course steam, high pressure steam, and we can also use thermal oil. Since we have very low rotating parts, we get very low running and maintenance cost, and we can achieve very high levels of dryness. We have a very long life cycle. Like I mentioned in the beginning, our first plant built in '79 is still operable today. And due to our energy recovery, we have a very fast return on investment. And it's not only feed or animal feed that gets sterilized. All product gets sterilized and non-oxidized within our dryer when you dry it. Another topic that I would like to raise is CO2 emissions for dryers. Dryers generally have very high CO2 emissions. This is a comparison we did for the pellets industry, but it's also applicable to other types of industry like the animal feed industry. Here we can see the amount of carbon dioxide released, kilograms of carbon dioxide per ton pellets produced. And as you can see in the bottom in the arranged in numbers, we are extremely low. And I'm sure a lot of you have questions on how we can achieve this, and we'll be happy to book a meeting and we can explain this a little bit more in detail. We can also integrate a carbon capture system to achieve even better results than this. Look at some general process data for our Exergy PSSD dryer. Here we can see where we are using steam, thermal oil, or hot gases as the heat source. What we'd like to highlight here is that the drying environment will still be the same no matter which heat source you're using. So product temperature is always going to be between 110 and 140 degrees Celsius no matter the heat source. And I know a lot of you probably say, well, that's way too high of a temperature for our products. But what you have to keep in mind is that the product only gets exposed to this steam or this temperatures for less than 20 seconds. And when we have conducted testing on our pilot test, we have found that because of this short residence time, it will not affect any products negatively. So I just want to explain a little bit about how our Exergy PSSD dryer works and operates. Like I mentioned, we're able to heat it indirectly. So for this example, to highlight that a little bit, I'm using thermal oil at 280 degrees as the heat source. We're starting by heating up the dryer with this thermal oil to operating temperature. Then we start spraying in some water to displace all the oxygen present with steam, superheated steam, before we start feeding any product. Then we start feeding in some product, and here the wet product meets this superheated steam that both carries and dries the product at the same time until it reaches our cyclone. In our high efficiency cyclone, the now dry product gets separated from the steam and gets discharged at the bottom through our rotary valve. And all of this from feed point to discharge point only takes 10 to 20 seconds. The steam that gets separated from the dry product then continues through our drying ducts to our bleed-off valve. And this is where we get our energy recovery from. Since we're constantly drying wet material, we're constantly evaporating water, which turns into steam within our dryer. And we keep building up the pressure. Well, we want to maintain a constant pressure in our dryer of about 2 to 2.5 bar of gauge. So in order to be able to maintain this pressure, we need to bleed off some of the steam constantly. And this is what we're doing here. This steam can then be used for other processes in your factory. For example, distillation columns, evaporators, can be used in condensing turbines to produce electricity, or it can be used for heating purposes. There's a lot of possibilities to regain some energy here. The steam that didn't get bled off then goes through our superheater again, gets superheated through our main circulation fan, meets the wet product, and the cycle continues. One thing we get asked a lot from clients is, well, what about, is there any room for a little bit of expansion in the future or increase of capacity? And we know that this can be a problem with conventional dryers that normally have a fixed capacity. Well, with our dryers, we have something that we call a loop heater, which enables us to increase the capacity at a later stage by only adding one component by about 40%. We have a client in Turkey at the moment, which we're supplying a dryer for, and they know that in a few years' time, they will have to increase their capacity, and hence why we are the perfect choice, because they can later on add a loop heater to increase the capacity by about 40%. Also get a lot of questions about very wet materials or very sticky materials like DDGS. Well, then we have a back mixing system where we pump the sticky or very wet material into a mixer. It gets mixed with some of the dry material from the cyclone before it gets fed into the dryer. Then the product gets dried like normal. The only difference is at the end of the cyclone, some of this dry material gets back mixed with the wet material, and the rest gets discharged as dry product. And to conclude this webinar, I would just like to summarize a little bit about what we talked about. We talked about the benefits that the animal feed will receive when dried in a superheated steam environment. It's the increase of bypass protein. It's the sterilization part. It's the increase in market value, and a lot of other good benefits. The benefits of using our Exergy PSSD dryer compared to traditional or conventional dryers is the no risk for fire explosions, the tremendous energy efficiency, but also the short residence time and the sterilization of the product. And I would like to thank you all for taking the time to join and attend our webinar. And